In this video, we'll be learning about the Build a Tyrant module in the Splice Dice expansion. In this mode, a Tyrant is created as players play a traditional game of Too Many Bones. Good old Nobulus is in his lab, picking up the baddies that players defeat in order to splice the best parts and create an Ultra Tyrant that the players will have to face at the end of the game. To get a general overview of the Splice Dice expansion, you can click the link above. The objective of this mode is to adventure through Daylore as normal, searching for a Tyrant. The only way to win is by defeating the Tyrant that Nobulus has cooked up before time runs out. Setting up is done as a normal Too Many Bones adventure, with some additions from the Splice Dice module. First, no Tyrant is chosen, and the day counter is set to 1. Players will then choose how long they wish their adventure to be, 8, 10, or 12 days. Just note that the longer the game, the stronger the Tyrant will be in the end. The number of days also determines the progress needed. For example, a game of 8 days requires 6 progress, tends to be shorter, and materializes in a less difficult game. This also determines how many general encounter cards are needed, as well as Tyrant encounter cards. Players can use encounters from the base game, Undertow, or a combination. In addition, they can use those included in 40 Days in Daylore as well. Tyrant encounter cards are chosen from the Build a Tyrant encounter cards, which are shuffled and drawn from according to this table. These two piles, the general encounters and Tyrant encounters, are then shuffled together. Undertow users will use their Day 1 and 2 cards, and base game users will use the respective Days 1 through 3 cards. These cards are then placed on top of the encounter deck, and players can cover up the rest of the deck with this card. Loot, gearlock, and other components are set up as normal, except for baddies, which we'll get to in a minute. Let's set up the lab first. The lab mat and the Tyrant mat can be set next to the battle mat. A peg will be placed in the following places on the Tyrant mat: the topmost position of the extra baddies track, the leftmost position of the attack form track, the leftmost position of the preferred target track, and the corresponding position for days in progress that players have chosen. The progress track and day track on the lab mat are not used in the Build a Tyrant mode. Now we can place a Splice Tyrant chip in both mats. All of these yellow lab dice are placed in the draw bag and then given to the first player. In order to complete setup, we'll do the initial splice. Using the baddies new to Splice Dice, 2 random 1-point and 2 random 5-point baddies are revealed. The Tyrant's initial stats are now set according to the highest corresponding stats on these baddies. For example, this sculpted Guru has the highest health, so the value is placed at 6 accordingly. The Wiser Golden Troll Ultra and the sculpted Guru are tied for 2 defense, so the stat is placed at 2. Each of the 4 stats will be set likewise. At the bottom of the mat are the Tyrant's baddie type positions. A peg is placed in each type for every baddie of that type from the 4 drawn. Now we can set up baddies. Players set these up as normal, optionally using the baddies from 40 Days of Daylore. In addition, all Splice Dice baddies with at least one matching baddie type as your Tyrant are included in the stacks. The gameplay for this expansion will continue basically as normal, except for a few additional steps. First, after each day, the draw bag is passed to the left-hand player. That player will then randomly draw and roll 4 lab dice. The player will then select a lab die from those rolled, and without communicating to his fellow gearlocks, place it in one of the 4 lab dice slots in the lab mat. Each player will do this, going left in order. Let's talk about how encounters will work. First, combat encounters. During battle, the first baddie that would normally go to the defeated stacks is instead placed in tank 1 on the lab mat. The second baddie defeated goes to tank 2, and so on. After tank 4 is filled, additional baddies go to the defeated stacks as normal. As for peaceful encounters, before moving on to the reward phase, players will create a queue using baddie points. From the top down, the baddies are placed in the tanks of the lab mat. The rest are then returned to the active stacks if there were any additional. Now let's talk about splicing, which is skipped on day 1. Directly after an encounter is completed, each lab die in the lab mat slots are resolved. First, the die between tanks 1 and 2, then the die between tanks 2 and 3, and so on. Each die takes into account the baddies in the 2 adjacent tanks, though only 1 tank needs to be filled. A lab die with no adjacent baddies is not resolved. Each symbol on the lab dice corresponds to a different stat, track, or other effect a Tyrant will gain. Let's talk about each symbol and how they are affected by the baddies adjacent. Initiative. If any adjacent baddie has an initiative greater than the Tyrant's stat is increased by 1. HP. If the total combined HP of the two adjacent baddies is greater than the Tyrant's current HP, the Tyrant's HP is increased by 1. Attack. If the total combined attack value of the two adjacent baddies is greater than the Tyrant's current attack, then the Tyrant's attack stat is increased by 1. Defense. If the total combined defense value of the two adjacent baddies is greater than the Tyrant's current defense, then the Tyrant's defense stat is increased by 1. The initiative and defense can only increase to a maximum value of 6, while attack and HP can increase to a max of 12. Let's talk about the 3 tracks. First, extra baddies. If any adjacent baddies has one of these extra baddie symbols, the track is advanced by 1 position. Next up is preferred target. If any adjacent baddie has a targeting that is to the right of the Tyrant's current targeting, the track is advanced by 1 position. Finally, attack form. If any adjacent baddie has the ranged attack form, this track is advanced by 1 position. These tracks can never be advanced past their last position. There are 2 more improvements a Tyrant can gain, the first being Splice Tyrant Dice. If this die is present, choose a baddie type from an adjacent baddie for which the Tyrant does not already have the Splice Tyrant die, then add that die to the Tyrant mat. A Tyrant can never have more than 3 Splice Tyrant Dice, so if a 4th were to be added, remove an existing one. The final improvement is skills. If this die is present, add the adjacent baddie with the highest point value to the Tyrant's skill area at the end of splicing. If the point values are the same, players can choose. Just like the Splice Tyrant Dice, a Tyrant cannot have more than 3 baddies in the skill area, so if a 4th is to be added, remove an existing one. Once all dice have been resolved, the baddies in the tanks are moved to their respective defeated stacks. Then, all lab dice are returned to the drop bag, and players continue on to the reward phase. Once players have earned the required amount of progress points, they may face the Tyrant if they wish. The Tyrant must be defeated before the number of days are exceeded in order to win the game. When facing the Tyrant, players will use the Splice Tyrant chip from the lab mat to represent the beast. Players can refer to the Tyrant mat for all of its details. The Tyrant stats are all equal to the current value shown on its mat. For tracks, the position marked in red that the peg is on or most recently passed determines its attribute. This Build the Tyrant card acts as the encounter card for the battle, and players will follow the instructions on the card. Some of the previous Tyrant encounter cards will have persistent effects that players will have to remember when the time comes to face off against the monster. On the Tyrant's turn, it will roll all of its collected Tyrant dice, as well as its attack and defense dice. In addition, the Tyrant has all the skills listed in the skills area. If a skill is ever listed twice, it only triggers once, and if there are differing values for the skills, the highest value takes precedence. Some of these skill combinations can get pretty complicated. Fortunately, Chip Theory has a conflicting skill sheet you can take a gander at on their website, which we'll link to in the description below. Good luck against your chosen beast, and thanks for watching this video on Build the Tyrant.